Hello and welcome to exercise 103, basic sample selection. This is going to be a pretty quick lesson, a pretty quick exercise. We're starting to get into some of the tools. We're exploring the tools, and the idea is that you need to be really fluent and be able to easily move around your samples and create the files that you need. If you remember in the lecture, I was saying one of the real keys to creating a robust and a high performance calibration is getting the right samples in your calibration set. So we're teaching you some of the tools that allow you to move in and out of these files really easily. So this lesson, again, exercise is very short, but this is about manual sample selection. Later on in the course, we're going to talk about some automated ways of doing this based on some principal component analysis, but this is the manual selection. So this is working from the samples screen and the menu bar, and you can go in and you can use various different ways of selecting out your samples. So, you know, there are different options from every ith sample based on sample number and things like this, but it's got a wide variety of different ways that you can make your sample selection. One of the most useful strategies really is ensuring that you've got the right samples in your calibration set. And if you have the luxury of having extra samples, to creating an independent validation set is also very useful. So the training set or the calibration set is supposed to represent future samples. Again, remember that near-infrared is very good at interpolating, but not as good as at extrapolating. So it's very important that you are modeling in the variation that you expect to see with your future unknown samples into your calibration set or your training set. So this is really the key. One of the ways to select samples is by position. This is used quite a bit. There are all sorts of different ways you can do it. If you think about various computer selections, you know, you can describe, for example, if you've got different rows of data, you can describe your rows like this. You can use dashes, you can use commas, you can select ranges. So when you're selecting samples by position, all of these options are available as well. You can also do it by sample name. So if you've got unique sample names, and hopefully you do in your files, your SVF files, you can actually call them out by sample name. So a good example here might be if you are setting up a validation set or for some reason have a particular naming sequence to your samples, you can easily go in and select them out by sample name. Okay, please note it only highlights the first occurrence. So again, it's really not a good practice to have the same sample in a file with the same sample name. You can distinguish them by your sample date timestamp, but it's really best if you have unique sample names in your sample SVF files. This has got a couple of screens that are out there just showing different ways of doing it. As you'll see shortly, this dialog will pop up and you've got different ways, different options to do it. This last one by sample is a compound selection. So you can select samples, for example, that begin with a certain string and containing another string. This might be useful, for example, if you brought in samples from two different instruments and they've got two different naming schemes, sample naming schemes, you could use something like this to easily separate out your samples. So by sample, again, this is compound. So you can look at your first part of a string of a sample name, and you can also say that it's including another set of characters. So this is a compound selection. If you click on the deleted samples, it's going to highlight all of the samples in your SVF file that do not have a check mark. So remember that those are inactive or ready to delete samples. So it will transfer and make all samples that do not have a check mark, and it will highlight them or select them. Every ICE sample I mentioned earlier, this is extremely useful. If you want to choose an independent validation set, for example, and you just want to have a consistent, impartial way of selecting a validation set, selecting every 7th sample, for example, might be a good option for you. And remaining samples. This is just toggling the selection switch. So if you've got an SVF file that has 100 samples and you select 40 and you write them to a file, if you click on remaining samples, it will unselect the 40 and it will select the 60. This is used surprisingly quite a bit. And as you're getting used to these sample selection routines, I would encourage you to write out these fractions of a sample file. For example, and in the example I just gave, if you've got 40 samples that you've selected and you wrote to a file and you plan to go on and use, I would encourage you to write those 60 samples to another file, and you might say deleted or not selected in the file name. It's surprising the number of times that you want to go back and look at these files, or you might want to predict against these files just to see how well they predict. And it's much easier while you've got these samples in front of you and you know what they are if you write them out to a file. So this is where remaining samples really comes into use. Remember that you can easily toggle, select your remaining samples and write it to a file. You can also write out ones and select ones that have no reference values. If you're working on a file of 200 samples, you send out for reference chemistries, you get 192 back. You might want to just grab those 8 and delete them out. This is a very easy way to find those samples. So this is a quick introduction to exercise 103. And we will take a quick look at UCal. So if you open up UCal and you've got your exercise samples in here, if you click on 103, you can see that there's only one file there. You can double click and bring it up. And I didn't cover it in the slides, but one of the things I want to make sure you all know is that your normal Windows conventions work for the selection. So if I hold down my control key, I can go in and select individual samples. You can see that they're highlighted. If I hold down my shift key, I bracket. So I select a range of samples. So that is also a manual way to select the samples. You can see that they're highlighted. Remember that this is different than the active or deleted flag. So all of these samples have a checkbox in them, so they are all active in this file. The options that we're talking about are found in here. I would encourage you all to just go in and play around and just become fluent in this and writing the samples. Once you do have the samples selected, you can go in and export out your samples, and you're given the option here to write out just the selected samples. So I think once you work with this a little bit, you'll find it's very easy to select out the right samples and write them to the appropriate files. So please jump into this exercise and work around a little bit with this file. Thank you.